Further ado, Charles Jennings.
Good morning, everybody. Can I ask you a question before we start? Which one of these lines is longer? Is the top one longer? Bottom one longer? Sorry? They're the same size. How many people think they're the same size? Okay, I want to talk about preconceptions. Okay, actually, the top one is 10% longer, right? So, I'm sorry, isn't it terrible to do that? The point I want to make is that, and it dovetails very nicely into what Geert was talking about in the opening session for those of us who were in the opening session, thinking about what learning is. I think we come with lots of preconceptions. We've seen this illusion before, therefore we think every time we see it again it's going to be the same. And it's, in this case, I'm sorry, it's not. This session really is about learning, and again, it picks up I think very neatly to the last question, or the last point that was made in the earlier session, where a person from the floor said, learning is not just information, and that for sure is absolutely right. For me, learning is a continuous process. It always occurs best in context. All the research tells us that learning is much, much better if it's in the context in where those new attributes, those new skills, those new capabilities are going to be used. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to focus then on 4 particular ways in which adults learn and give some examples of how we can use those attributes. But just before I start, thinking about continuous learning, actually, when you look at organizations, particularly commercial organizations around the world, there's been a very clear trend over the last 25 to 30 years. And that is a trend where the intangible assets in the organization are slowly increasing and the tangible assets are decreasing. So if you look at these graphs here, in 1975, if we looked at the S&P 500, in other words, the 500 largest companies in the world, of their market value, 80% were tangible assets. That was buildings, oil rigs, plant machinery, etc., etc. By 2009, less than 20% of that was tangible. And so it had basically flipped. And those intangible assets, which are now the vast majority of most of our organizations, are in people, they're in technology, they're in brand, they're in goodwill, they're in all those sorts of things. And if you look at the bottom table here, the bottom graph, and I think it's very appropriate that Hans is here from BT, when you look at, for example, the telecommunications services industry, and I'm sorry it's very small, but actually the tangible assets of telecommunications industry are tiny. And in fact, some companies that provide us with our mobile services and so on are nothing more than billing systems. And behind those billing systems are obviously technology and people. But the point I'm making is that the real value in terms of how we maintain the value of our organization and build the value of our organizations and so on is actually the people are absolutely critical. And actually, learning and improvement is critical for that, a significant bit of that intangible. But at the same time, we've got some major challenges, and those of you that have read the Towards Maturity benchmark from 2012, I'd recommend that you, if you haven't, that you download it. But there were 3 things that stuck out to me around this. First one was that the vast majority of people, over 90% of people, are seeking to respond faster to changing business conditions. And only about 25% feel that they're doing that. In fact, about 50% of the high-performing organizations, the top quartile organizations, are doing it, but there's still a huge gap there. Secondarily, in terms of continuous learning, 9 out of 10, 90%, recognize the importance of integrating learning into the workflow. And for 40% or so, it's now considered to be a critical issue. And lastly, over 90%, 94% are looking to speed up the application of learning back into work. But again, there's a big gap between what is needed and what's actually happening. So I think that's a major challenge. So the first point I'd like to make is, I guess, that change is absolutely critical in keeping up with change. And this is my, I spent some time with a guy called Brad Benson, who's the chief of staff at Intel, about 18 months ago, and we were doodling some ideas about the formulas and how learning and change worked in, and Brad worked up this very simple formula, and then I built on it. But as far as I'm concerned, if the rate of change, the rate of learning in an organization is greater than the external change plus the internal change, result is success. If it's the other way around, result is failure. So there's a huge imperative on us to help people develop continuously at a high rate, or else we end up like this. It's either adaptation or extinction. Global Fortune 500, only 14% of the Fortune 500 companies that existed in 1959 still exist today. And in fact, the average, that's US, the top US companies, the average lifespan of S&P companies, global companies, the top global companies in the world, the average lifespan is 15 years. And I think that, it's a real imperative for us. Equally, impact of man on species loss. The Tasmanian tiger here that disappeared, last photographs we have in about 1930s, now extinct. That rate has just been increased hugely over what they call the background extinction rate. In other words, what humans are doing have huge impacts on that. So the point I'm trying to make here is the fact that we really need to change the way we think and the way we act. Oops, if I can press the right button. The way we act. So if it's a continuous process, how do we best learn? There's absolutely no shortage of learning theories. We could spend days, well, there are courses of weeks, months, years, looking at learning theory, going right back to Ivan Pavlov up in the top left there, through B.F. Skinner below him, through Jean Piaget, through Jean Lavey, through the whole panoply here. So we have no shortage of theories. But in my experience, there are 4 fundamental drivers for learning. They are exposure to rich and challenging experiences, the opportunity to practice, the participation in rich conversations and networks, and lastly, the spaces for reflection. So what I'd like to do is look at these and talk about some examples of why, first of all, why they're important and some examples of how organizations are using them. Before I do that, just to come back from the point I made about context, all the research that I've read tells us that performance impact is greater when it's integrated into the workflow. The largest impact on performance is when it's integrated in the workflow. The Corporate Leadership Council carried out some work about 6 or 7 years ago. They identified 15 different things managers could do which would improve performance. And there were 3 of those 15 which had a significant impact, 20%, around about 20% performance uplift. And they weren't very complex, they were very simple things. But they were about 3 times the impact on performance than simply making sure that people had the right knowledge and skills. Giving people or helping people develop the right knowledge and skills improves performance, but it's just a little bit. But telling them what's expected of them, how they're going to be measured, having absolute clarity about what people need to do, and then giving them challenging opportunities to stretch and challenge, and then the chance to reflect on what that challenge has helped them do and what they've learned from it. Those things actually lift the performance bar about 20%. So experience, and again, Gert gave, I don't think any presentation can go by without an Albert Einstein quote, but learning is experience, everything else is just information. And just to reflect on the point I've made about impact on employee performance, this bit of research from the Learning and Development Roundtable, and I realise that you're not going to be able to read this. When you get these slides later on, you'll be able to have a look at them. But I always put these in because people will say, well, how did this data come? How did they get this data? This was extremely rigorous survey and research data, and this just tells you exactly the methodology and the how this data is generated. But basically, in terms of impact of learning methods on employee performance, as I say, 300% on-the-job learning will improve performance 300% over formal training programs. Equally, in terms of engagement, engaged employees, and this was done again down here in the detail. The engagement scale consists of 14 items measuring employee rational and emotional commitment to the organisation. It's a 7-point scale, and this one here is 5.5 or above on the 7-point scale. But those employees who had been engaged in 11 or more on-the-job learning activities in the last month were 2.6 times more engaged than those that weren't. And again, if we're looking for a highly engaged, high-performing workforce, we really need to look at how we integrate that into the workflow, development into the workflow. And I think it boils down to this, and for me, this is the sort of key message, I guess, I want to get across. And that is, a lot of learning and development people tend to think about workplace learning as what you see on the left there, about adding learning to work. How can we make sure that our programs integrate, we can parachute learning into the workflow and inject activities into the workflow for the explicit purpose of learning. So how can we take our away from work learning and put it into the workflow, and that will help. Actually, that will give us some benefit, but the big challenge here is actually how do we extract learning from the workflow. And that means thinking about things differently. It means not thinking about the flow of learning to work, but actually thinking about work to learning. It also has huge impact, and in fact I'm in the States in a little while, in a month and a half or so, talking at the Question Mark conference about evaluation. It means that we're moving from a world where we're looking at learning metrics to where we're looking at performance metrics. So I think that's a very important point about thinking about how we learn and how we inject learning into the workflow. Again, I apologise for the small print here, but to give you some examples, we could expand the scope of work. We can give stretch assignments. We can increase decision-making opportunities. We can do all sorts of things. We can persuade and teach others and observe. We might have coaching and mentoring and all sorts of other approaches. We can create or exploit situations of change and adversity and help people develop in that way. Challenging relationships. But I want to focus on the last one here about making work visible and discussing it. And I want to give you a couple of examples of organisations that have done this well and achieved really good results from it. So Qualcomm is a company in California. It usually appears in the top 3 or 4 companies in terms of employee engagement and the best companies to work for when Forbes and so on do their analysis. It's a high-tech company. And what Qualcomm have done, and what I really like about this as an example of sharing work through storytelling, is that they've used really, really basic technology. Some years ago in Qualcomm, they instituted something called the 52-week program. And basically, it consists of a weekly email that goes out to employees. And the email is simply a story told by someone in the organisation. It may be a senior person, it may be anyone in the organisation, talking about their work, what's challenged them, what insights they've had, how it might have made them think differently, work differently, do things differently. And they simply send it out by email. So the technology that's used is just email. And it's being used for changing culture, values, attitudes, behaviours, informing, building, basically meshing the organisation together as a holistic team. They use it now for onboarding new employees the first time, as people are taken on board. They actually use this as a tool to help them understand what the organisation is really about. It's managed by the Qualcomm Learning Centre, which is basically the Chief Learning Officer, Tamar Elks, and her team manage that. They go out and do the interviews and maybe do a bit of the editing and so on, but it's really simple. And the stories are just short. They're about, if you put them printed on a page, they're about 1.5 pages, 2 pages. It's had huge impact in terms of developing an understanding and helping people develop in a continuous way through storytelling. The other one is through narrating work, and some colleagues and I were working just over the last 18 months with a very large pharmaceutical company. And we were working with their research team, and they had just changed their policy. And again, Gert was talking about, interesting, what GSK were doing in terms of their open innovation. This, in fact, wasn't GSK, but an equally large company. But their research teams, up until a couple of years ago, were not allowed even to speak to other researchers working on different pharmaceutical products. They were kept apart. It was considered to be not the thing to do. They realized that actually that was not going to help their innovation. So we worked with them, and initially, I've used the word cajoled there. We actually cajoled people to narrate their work. It required quite a lot of cajoling. Getting them to come on using a microblogging tool, to come on and talk about what they've been doing. Just once a day, a micro post in terms of, this is what I've achieved today, or this is what still is challenging me, this is what's this is the questions I'm looking to answer, etc., etc. And then we held weekly conference calls, a sort of virtual coffee, just to discuss issues and start to build together, thinking about how they can share and how they can innovate collaboratively across the entire research team. After a while, it didn't require us. After several months, we didn't even need any facilitation, any organising, any cajoling. It just got up and ran by itself. So they're two examples of that last area there about making work visible and discussing it with other.
Charles, we're running a little tight on time, so can you cover the other 3 in 5 minutes?
Yes, I will. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Practice. Space practice, power of space practice. Again, we've known for 120, 130 years since Herman Ebbinghaus did his research that learning in context and reinforcement will actually assist our ability to change our behaviour, to do things better. So space practice is absolutely critical. And again, some research recently, and I'd suggest you have a look at Donald Clark's website. He reported it just last week around some recent research that showed that training programs in a particular context had actually no impact at all. The only thing that really had impact was space practice. Conversation, best learning technology ever invented. Again, when I was Chief Learning Officer at Reuters, I've often said that the best money we spent was on pizzas. The best learning money we spent on pizzas. Because basically we had these pizza sessions for technologists, and they got together, 2-hour conversations, they shared their technical expertise, we coached individual developers. Many of them were young. It was in a centre, it started in a centre in Bangkok where the average age was 24. They were very young technical people, and they sat round on a Thursday afternoon and they talked about the challenges that they'd had and exactly what they were working on, and they shared that with their colleagues, and they focused on these challenging projects, and they were managed and facilitated, and the facilitators were sort of coached by the L&D people in terms of how they could start the session off. Incredibly successful. It allowed us to take a huge amount of cost out for a start, but the main point was it allowed us to actually get people up to speed really quickly, a way in which we couldn't do it by taking them outside and running them through courses and putting them back in again. And there's all sorts of methods for conversation. I just flicked through this, but the fishbowl technique, some of you may be aware of. Fishbowl is where you get a small number of people maybe carrying out a conversation with a larger group listening to that conversation. And fishbowls, you have open or closed. The one on the right here is an open fishbowl where you have, in this case, 4 people having a conversation in an open seat, so people can come out from the listening group, can come out and sit when particular issues are discussed. So there's a range of conversations, a range of approaches for conversation. And reflection, and I think this is probably the most powerful and probably the most underused in organisation, is about asking the right questions. And I'll just spend 30 seconds telling you about Nadal, and then I want to talk about the American military in terms of how they use reflection really well. This man on the right here, Santiago Alvarez de Mon, was telling me he's worked with Nadal for the last 10 years or so. And those of you that have ever seen Rafael Nadal play tennis, when he's fit to play tennis, will have observed that he's rather obsessive. Everything is done in a very, very obsessive way. And in fact, that's learned behaviour, because Nadal never makes the same mistake twice in a match. because he is absolutely obsessively reflective. So that if you see Nadal play tennis and he, hits a serve long, he'll then go back and he'll do all sorts of behaviour at the end of the game, the set or whatever, and will actually, he's obsessively reflecting. And Alvarez, Santiago said that really he says that Nadal is not one of the top 5 tennis players in the world. Absolutely, never been one of the top 5 tennis players in the world. Yet he's won 11 Grand Slams and et cetera, simply because of this obsessive reflection on what went wrong and how could I fix it. The US military is also obsessively reflective. Their after-action reviews are absolutely in the fabric of the way that they do things, and they always ask these same 4 questions. What did we set out to do? What actually happened? Why did it happen? And what are we going to do next time? And I'd ask you in your own organisations, how often do you do that? How often do managers sit down with their teams? Or how often when you're working on projects, do you sit down and say, okay, what do we set out to do? What's happened so far? Why did that happen? And what we do next time? In other words, what can we learn out of that? And I can't step down without giving a plug for this model, which I've worked with for about 12 or 15 years now, 70-20-10, which I think actually ties it together. I won't spend any time on this, but 70-20-10 approach simply says most of our learning is through experience, reflection, practice. A lot of it is through help with from other people, and actually the formal bit, the structured bit, only provides a smaller amount. Forget the numbers because the numbers are not really relevant, but that's extremely important. So with that, can I just encourage you we've just established this community site, this community forum, encourage you to join it and get the resources that are going to come out of that once that's launched. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you.